March 23, 1943. The Tunisian desert east of El Ghatar, 2 in the morning. The men of the 1st Infantry Division were on their knees in the dark, and they were not praying. They were digging. Picks struck limestone with a sound like cracking teeth. Entrenching tools scraped against gravel that had baked under the North African sun for 10,000 years. The ground did not want to be moved. The men moved it anyway. Private first class or colonel, it didn't matter. Everyone dug. Holes 2 feet wide, 4 feet deep, wider at the bottom so a man could crouch below the blast line of a shell. Then, they connected the holes with shallow crawl trenches. Then, they piled the excavated rock into low parapets, packing it tight enough to stop a rifle round. Then, they cleared fields of fire, cutting brush, kicking away stones that blocked a sight line, marking ranges to landmarks they could barely see. Some units strung wire, others buried mines. They had been doing this for 3 hours. They would keep doing it until the sun came up, and no one had to be told. 9 miles to the east, 50 tanks of the German 10th Panzer Division sat with their engines cold, waiting for dawn. Their crews had fought at Kasserine Pass 5 weeks earlier. There, they had driven the Americans back 85 miles in 6 days. They had overrun positions that were barely scratched into the earth. They had watched American soldiers abandon equipment, lose entire artillery batteries, scatter into the desert in confusion. The 10th Panzer had taken more than 3,000 American prisoners in a week. Their commander, General Major Fritz von Broich, had every reason to expect this morning to look the same. At 6 a.m., the panzers rolled into the valley. Dust clouds rose behind them. Marder tank destroyers and panzer grenadiers followed in half-tracks. The formation was textbook: armor forward, infantry echeloned behind, exactly the way they had punched through American lines at Kasserine. They moved fast because they believed what they were driving into was the same army they had broken in February. They were wrong. The first tanks hit a minefield. While they slowed to find a path through, American anti-tank guns opened fire from positions the Germans had not seen. Then artillery, massed, coordinated, falling on pre-registered points that someone had calculated in the dark. The 601st Tank Destroyer Battalion, dug into hull-down positions behind a ridge, began putting rounds into the flanks of panzers that were now channeled by the mines into narrow lanes. Within an hour, 30 of von Broich's 50 tanks were burning. By noon, the 10th Panzer Division was retreating east, leaving wreckage scattered across the valley floor. If you want to see what these American soldiers built and why the Germans never broke it, hit like and subscribe. It helps this story find the people it was made for. Here is what matters about El Ghatar, and it is not what most accounts focus on. Most accounts tell you this was the first American victory against German armor. That is true, but it is not the point. The point is what made it possible. Because the men who stopped those panzers on March 23rd were, in many cases, the same men who had been routed at Kasserine on February 19th. Same division, same soldiers, same war. 5 weeks apart. What changed was not courage. The men at Kasserine had not been cowards. What changed was what they did between sundown and sunrise. At Kasserine, American units had halted for the night and done almost nothing. Foxholes were shallow, sometimes just prone shelters a few inches deep, barely enough to shield a man lying flat. Positions were scattered without a plan. Fields of fire were not cleared. Wire was not laid. Mines were not placed. When the panzers came at dawn, they drove through positions that might as well not have existed. An army pamphlet published after the disaster used a phrase that became a motto across every training camp in America. 2 words: dig or die. But digging was only the beginning. What the American army built in the weeks after Kasserine was not a foxhole. It was a system. And the system had rules that applied to every infantry unit every night, no matter where they stopped, whether for 6 hours or 6 days, whether in the desert or a forest, or a French field bordered by ancient hedgerows. The rules were printed in field manuals. They were drilled in replacement training centers from Georgia to Texas. They were enforced by sergeants who had survived the places where the rules did not exist. And here is the detail you need to hold on to, because it comes back later in a way you will not expect. The tool that made the system possible, the folding entrenching tool that every American infantryman carried on his hip from 1943 onward, was not an American invention. The U.S. Army copied it. They reverse-engineered it from a captured German design, the Klappspaten, a folding spade the Wehrmacht had been issuing since 1938. The Americans took the enemy's own tool, manufactured it by the millions, and used it to build something the enemy could never break. But the tool was just steel and wood. What made it lethal was the doctrine behind it, a set of instructions for what to build, how fast, and in what order that turned every overnight halt into a defensive position integrated with the most powerful artillery arm on the planet. The Germans had the same shovel. They did not have the same system. And by the time they understood the difference, it was already too late. El-Ghoutar was the first proof. It would not be the last. Because what happened in that Tunisian valley in March of 1943 was about to be repeated, on a scale the men digging in that rocky ground could not have imagined, across Normandy, through the hedgerows, into the Ardennes, and up to a hilltop in France where 700 Americans would dig in for one night, and then hold that position against 4 German panzer divisions for 6 days. But before we get there, we need to understand what the system actually was. Not just holes in the ground, but what went into them, around them, and above them. Because the Germans kept attacking these positions at dawn, and they kept failing. And the question that German commanders could not answer, the question that appears again and again in their after-action reports, was not why the Americans fought hard. It was how the Americans built so much, so fast, in a single night. That answer starts in a place most people have never heard of, and it starts with a man holding a stopwatch. Summer of 1943, Camp Croft, South Carolina. 112 degrees on the parade ground, and the air so thick with humidity that a man's uniform was soaked through before breakfast. A sergeant stood at the edge of a clay field holding a stopwatch. In front of him, 40 recruits knelt in a line, each one gripping an M1943 entrenching tool, the folding shovel they had been issued that morning. Most of them had never held one before. Some had been farmers 3 months ago. Some had been clerks, factory workers, students. None of them understood yet why this sergeant cared more about the speed of their digging than the accuracy of their shooting. He clicked the stopwatch. Go! 40 blades hit South Carolina clay. The soil was not cooperative. Red, dense, threaded with roots. The men hacked at it, scraped it, scooped it out with their hands when the blade jammed. Some knelt, some lay flat. One man tried to stand over his hole and dig downward like he was planting a fence post. The sergeant walked the line without speaking. After 30 minutes, he clicked the stopwatch again. Stop. Most of the holes were shallow, a foot, maybe 18 inches. Piles of loose dirt sat on the edges, unformed, spilling back in. One man had dug barely a hand's width. The sergeant looked at the line of holes and said nothing for a long time. Then he told them what a German 88mm shell does to a man lying in a hole 12 inches deep. He told them what a Panzer Mark IV does when it drives over a prone shelter. The treads push the walls in, the dirt collapses, and the man inside is buried alive or crushed. He told them about Kasserine. He told them that the men who died there had dug holes exactly like the ones in front of him right now. Tomorrow, he said, they would do it again. And the day after that. And every day until they could dig a standing foxhole, 4 feet deep, 2 feet wide, flared at the bottom, in under 30 minutes. Because 30 minutes was the standard. That was how long you had between the moment your platoon stopped moving and the moment the first German shell could find you. This was the Infantry Replacement Training Center system. 17 weeks of it. And the digging was not a side exercise. It was the spine. Here is what the field manual required. And pay attention to this list, because when you see what it produced on an actual battlefield, you will understand why German officers kept writing the same sentence in their reports. A single infantry company halting for the night was required to construct the following before dawn. 2-man fighting positions, not scattered randomly, but placed by the platoon leader according to terrain, with interlocking fields of fire so that every approach was covered by at least 2 weapons. Crawl trenches connecting the positions so a man could move between holes without exposing himself. A cleared fire lane in front of each position, brush cut, debris removed, range markers placed at 50, 100, and 200 yards. Concertina wire strung across the most likely avenues of approach. Anti-personnel mines beyond the wire. And, this is the part that changed everything, pre-registered artillery coordinates for every gap, every draw, every piece of dead ground that an attacker might use. That last element is what most people miss. The foxhole was just the container. What made it lethal was the connection to the guns behind it. Here is how it worked. Before a company dug its first hole, the company commander walked the ground with his forward artillery observer. Together, they identified the terrain features an attacker would use: a tree line, a fold in the ground, a road. The observer assigned each one a number and radioed those numbers along with precise coordinates to the fire direction center miles to the rear. The FDC computed the firing data, elevation, deflection, charge, and distributed it to every battery in range. The guns did not fire. They waited. But the math was already done. The shells were already sorted. The coordinates were already plotted on the charts. All of it before the first strand of wire was uncoiled. If a German company attacked that position at dawn, the American forward observer did not need to calculate anything. He picked up his radio, set a number, and within 3 minutes, sometimes less, dozens of shells landed on the exact point where the Germans were crossing open ground. The Germans never saw the observer. They never heard the guns until the rounds were already in the air. They arrived at what they believed was a line of simple foxholes and walked into a wall of high explosive steel that seemed to come from nowhere. Now think about what this means at scale. A single infantry division, roughly 15,000 men, halting for the night, could construct more than 1,000 fighting positions, lay miles of wire, plant hundreds of mines, and pre-register artillery on dozens of targets. All in one night, all from scratch. And all of it would be done again the next night, in a different place, from nothing. The positions they left behind were abandoned without hesitation. They were not permanent. They were not meant to be. They were meant to last exactly one dawn. The Germans built fortifications too. They were, in many ways, the finest combat engineers in the world. But German defensive doctrine was designed for positions that were held for weeks, months, sometimes years. The Siegfried Line, the Atlantic Wall, the Gustav Line, concrete, steel, months of construction. What the Germans did not have was a system for building a complete, integrated defensive position from bare ground in 8 hours using nothing but folding shovels, wire, and a radio. And that gap between what the Germans expected to find at dawn and what was actually waiting for them was about to be tested in a place where the ground itself seemed designed to make digging impossible. June 1944, northern France, the hedgerows of Normandy, where every field was a fortress, and both sides knew it. But only one side could build a new one every night. June 13th, 1944, 1 week after D-Day. A company from the 29th Infantry Division sat in a Norman field, surrounded on all 4 sides by walls of earth and tangled root that had been growing since before the American Revolution. The hedgerows of Normandy were not hedges. That word makes Americans think of the neat green borders around suburban lawns. These were something else entirely. Each field in the bocage was enclosed by a berm of packed earth 3 to 5 feet high, centuries old, with root systems so dense that a man could not push a bayonet through them. On top of the berm grew a thicket of oak, hazel, and bramble so thick that it blocked all sight lines beyond the next field. The roads between the fields were sunken lanes, worn down over hundreds of years until they sat 4 or 5 feet below the surrounding ground, like trenches that nature had already dug. An American lieutenant standing in one of those fields could not see the field next to his. He could not see the road. He could not see the enemy, who was almost certainly dug in behind the next hedgerow, 60 yards away, invisible. For the Germans, this was paradise. They had occupied Normandy for 4 years. They knew every lane, every gap, every drainage ditch. They placed machine guns at the corners of fields where 2 hedgerows met, creating interlocking fire that covered every open space. They dug firing positions into the base of the berms, roofed them with logs and earth, and concealed the openings so well that an American squad could walk within 10 feet without seeing them. A German corporal from the 275th Infantry Division, captured in the first weeks, told his interrogators something blunt. "Americans use infantry cautiously," he said. "If they used it the way Russians do, they would be in Paris now." He was not wrong about the caution, but he was wrong about what it meant. Because what the Americans were doing every night in those hedgerow fields was not hesitating. It was building. Picture what happened each evening as the light failed. An American rifle company that had spent the day fighting forward, field by field, hedgerow by hedgerow, sometimes gaining 200 yards in 12 hours, would halt at its farthest position and begin the routine. The same routine they had practiced in South Carolina, in Georgia, in the red clay and the swamp heat. But now, the ground was different, and the doctrine adapted to it. The hedgerow berm itself became the front wall of the position. Soldiers did not need to dig a parapet. The earth wall was already there, thick enough to stop anything short of a direct hit from an 88. What they dug were fighting positions into the base of the berm, angled so that each hole had a narrow firing slit facing the next field. They cut lanes through the vegetation on top, not wide enough for the enemy to spot, but wide enough to see and shoot through. They placed their automatic weapons at the corners, just as the Germans did, so that the Browning automatic rifles and the 30 caliber machine guns covered the open ground from 2 directions at once. Then came the wire. Concertina coils laid across the gaps between fields, the gates, the drainage breaks, the places where a man or a vehicle could pass through the berm. Behind the wire, mines. Trip flares rigged to illuminate the ground in front of the wire if anything touched it. And behind all of it, the radio. The forward observer, sitting in a foxhole with a map and a handset, with every artillery battery in the battalion already zeroed on the fields to the east. By midnight, a position that had been bare ground at sunset was a defensive network that would take a German company-strength counterattack to overrun. And that counterattack would have to cross open ground under pre-registered artillery fire to reach it. Remember that detail about the stopwatch in the training camp? 30 minutes for a fighting position. Now multiply it by 100 men working through a summer night that lasted barely 6 hours. By dawn, the company had not just dug in. It had wired in, mined in, and registered every approach with the guns. And this is where the German problem began to compound. German doctrine in Normandy relied on the counterattack. It was the foundation of their defensive strategy. When they lost ground, a field, a crossroads, a village, they did not simply accept the loss and build a new line. They counterattacked. Immediately if possible, at dawn if not. Small, violent thrusts by infantry and whatever armor was available aimed at retaking the lost position before the enemy could consolidate. It had worked against the British. It had worked against the Soviets. It was how the Wehrmacht held ground despite being outnumbered everywhere. But in the bocage, the Germans began running into something they had not encountered before. When they launched their dawn counterattack against the field they had lost the previous afternoon, they did not find exhausted Americans sleeping in shallow scrapes. They found a finished position. Wire across every gap, mines in the approaches, machine guns at the corners with cleared fire lanes, and artillery that arrived within minutes of the first German movement, landing with a precision that suggested the Americans had known exactly where the attack would come. German after-action reports from June and July of 1944 repeat a pattern. The counterattack stepped off at the planned time. The lead element reached the wire and took fire from positions that had not existed 12 hours earlier. Artillery struck the assembly area before the second wave could deploy. Casualties were heavy. The counterattack was called off. What those reports never quite say, but what the pattern makes clear, is that the Germans had no answer for an army that could build a fortified position from nothing in a single night. You cannot counterattack a position that did not exist when you planned the counterattack. You cannot reconnoiter defenses that are constructed after your reconnaissance patrol returns. Every dawn was a new problem, and the problem was always the same and always unsolvable. But the hedgerows were a slow grind. Fields measured in yards. Both sides dug in, both sides bled. The system worked, but it worked in miniature. One company, one field, one night at a time. What no one on the American side yet knew was that the system was about to be tested at a scale that would have seemed insane to the men digging in those Norman fields. Because Adolf Hitler was about to order 4 panzer divisions to drive straight through the American line in a single night. And standing in their path would be a division that had arrived at its positions less than 24 hours earlier. A division that had not yet finished digging in. July 25th, 1944. The sky over Saint-Lô turned black at 10 in the morning. More than 1,500 American heavy bombers dropped 4,000 tons of explosives on a strip of Norman countryside 3 miles long and 1 mile deep. The ground shook so violently that American soldiers in their foxholes a mile behind the target line felt their teeth rattle. When the smoke cleared, the German front line, the Panzer Lehr Division, one of the finest armored formations in the Wehrmacht, had ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. Its commander, General Lieutenant Fritz Bayerlein, reported that 70% of his men were dead, wounded, or too dazed to function. His tanks were buried under rubble. His communication lines were severed. Operation Cobra had broken the bocage stalemate. Within 48 hours, American armor was pouring through the gap. Within a week, the front was no longer a line. It was a flood. On August 1st, Lieutenant General George S. Patton's Third Army was officially activated, and Patton did what Patton always did. He attacked. His armored columns drove south, then west into Brittany, then swung east toward the heart of France. The speed was breathtaking, 30, 40, 50 miles a day. Towns that had been behind German lines at breakfast were in American hands by dinner. And every night, no matter how fast they had moved, the men dug in. This is worth pausing on because it reveals something about the system that goes beyond doctrine. These were not soldiers defending a static line. These were soldiers in pursuit, advancing at a pace that left their own supply trucks behind. They were exhausted. They had been fighting for nearly 2 months straight. Every instinct said to collapse and sleep. But the routine held. Stop, dig, wire, register, sleep in shifts, be ready at dawn, move again. The sergeants who enforced this were not being cautious. They were keeping their men alive. Because even in a pursuit, even when the enemy was running, the Germans counterattacked. It was reflexive, institutional, baked into their officer training since the days of the Kaiser. A retreating German battalion that found an open American flank would turn and strike it without waiting for orders. And if the Americans at that flank had not dug in, if they were sleeping on open ground because the war seemed to be almost over, they died. So the men dug, every night, even when it seemed pointless, even when they cursed the sergeants who made them do it. Now hold that image in your mind, an army that digs in every night as a reflex, the way a boxer keeps his guard up even when his opponent looks finished, because what happened next made that reflex the difference between victory and catastrophe. By the first week of August, every road through the town of Avranches was choked with American vehicles. Avranches sat at the base of the Cotentin Peninsula, at the southwestern corner of Normandy, and it was the bottleneck. Every tank, every truck, every jeep in Patton's Third Army had to pass through this single corridor to reach the open country beyond. If the Germans could retake Avranches, they would cut Patton's supply line. Third Army, already stretched thin across Brittany and racing east, would be stranded without fuel, ammunition, or food. Adolf Hitler saw this on a map and believed he saw an opportunity. On August 2nd, he ordered a counteroffensive. 4 panzer divisions, the 2nd SS Panzer, the 1st SS Panzer, the 2nd Panzer, and the 116th Panzer, would strike westward through the town of Mortain, 20 miles east of Avranches, smash through whatever American forces were there, and drive to the coast. The operation was codenamed Lüttich. It would launch on the night of August 6th. Here is the detail that makes this story what it is. Thanks to Ultra, the Allied program that had broken the German Enigma code, American intelligence knew the attack was coming. They knew the direction, they knew the approximate strength, they knew the date. But knowing and stopping are not the same thing. The forces available at Mortain were limited. The 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, the same unit that had dug in at El Guitar, had captured the town on August 3rd. But Patton needed the 1st Division for his eastern drive. So on August 6th, the 30th Infantry Division was ordered to Mortain to relieve them. The 30th Division. Old Hickory. National Guard boys from Tennessee, Georgia, and the Carolinas. They had landed at Normandy on D+3 and fought through the hedgerows for 2 months. They were experienced, they were tired, and they were about to walk into the path of the largest German armored counteroffensive since D-Day. The relief was rushed. Units arrived piecemeal throughout the day and into the evening of August 6th. Some battalions reached their assigned positions only hours before the German attack was scheduled to begin. There was no time for detailed reconnaissance, no time to study the terrain the way the manuals prescribed. The company commanders walked the ground in fading light, pointed at hedgerows and hilltops, and told their men to start digging. One of those positions was Hill 314, a rocky summit east of Mortain that overlooked the main road running west toward Avranches. The 2nd Battalion of the 120th Infantry Regiment climbed the hill in the late afternoon. Their commander, Lieutenant Colonel Ebert Hardaway, placed his companies around the summit in a rough perimeter, about 700 men. They had with them their rifles, their machine guns, their mortars, a limited supply of ammunition, and their entrenching tools. They began digging. The sun set around 9:30. The night was short, barely 6 hours of darkness at that latitude in August. Somewhere to the east, the engines of 4 panzer divisions were warming up. The men on Hill 314 did not know exactly what was coming. They knew something was. They could hear vehicle movement in the distance, the low grinding sound that tanks make when they move in column on hard roads. But they could not see anything. So they did the only thing the army had taught them to do when they could not see the enemy and did not know what was next. They kept digging. What happened when the sun rose on August 7th, and what those 700 men did for the next 6 days with nothing but the positions they had scraped out of that hilltop, is one of the most extraordinary small unit actions of the entire war. And it began with a sound that every man on that hill recognized. The sound they had been trained to fear more than any other. Diesel engines. Close. And getting closer. August 7th, 1944. 2:45 in the morning. Fog. The fog that rolled into the valleys around Mortain was so thick that a man could not see 20 yards. It blanketed the roads, the fields, the slopes of Hill 314. The men in their freshly dug foxholes could hear the world changing around them, but could not see it. Engines. Treads on pavement. Voices. German voices. Somewhere below and to the east, moving fast. At 2 minutes before 3, the 2nd SS Panzer Division surged forward in 2 columns. The northern column drove straight through Mortain. The southern column swung below the town towards Saint-Hilaire, aiming for the road to Avranches. They moved without headlights, navigating by the pale glow of compass dials, and they moved fast because the fog was a gift. It grounded the American fighter bombers that had been burning German armor on every road in Normandy for 2 months. The northern column hit the town first. There was almost no resistance. The 2nd Battalion's command post, set up inside Mortain, was overrun within minutes. Lieutenant Colonel Ebert Hardaway, the battalion commander, was caught in the chaos. Communications between the town and the hilltop went dead. The companies on Hill 314 heard the firing below, heard the rumble of tanks in streets they had walked through that afternoon, and then heard nothing. The radio link to battalion was gone. On the summit, no one gave an order to panic. No one gave an order at all, at first, because the chain of command had just been cut in half. The company commanders, spread around the perimeter in the positions they had dug only hours earlier, held their men in place and waited for information that was not coming. Then, Captain Reynold Erickson arrived. Erickson commanded F Company. He was 24 years old. Before the war, he had been a farmer in Iowa. Corn and soybeans, flatland, quiet seasons. He had been at the battalion command post in Mortain when the Germans struck. When the post was overrun, he gathered roughly 40 men, stragglers, runners, soldiers separated from their units in the dark, and fought his way back up the hill. It took him most of the day. German patrols and half-tracks blocked every route. He changed direction again and again, losing men, finding new paths, until G Company's mortars on the hilltop dropped rounds on the Germans long enough for Erickson and his group to crawl the last 100 yards into the perimeter. He was now the senior officer on Hill 314. He had roughly 700 men, most of them from companies that had never worked together before this week. 3 of his 4 company commanders had never led a company in combat. They were low on ammunition because the resupply trucks that were supposed to reach them that morning were now burning on a road controlled by the SS. But Erickson had one thing that 4 German panzer divisions did not know about. 2 men in a foxhole near the summit, with a radio and a clear view of every road for miles. First Lieutenant Charles Bartz and Second Lieutenant Robert Weiss were forward observers attached from the 230th Field Artillery Battalion. Their job was simple in theory and almost impossible in practice: to see the enemy, calculate his position, and call it into the guns. On flat ground, a forward observer's life expectancy in combat was measured in minutes because the enemy knew that killing the man with the radio silenced the artillery. But Bartz and Weiss were not on flat ground. They were on top of a hill that rose more than 1,000 feet above the surrounding countryside, and the fog that blinded everyone else was below them. From their foxhole near the summit, they could see the roads, the crossroads, the assembly areas where German tanks were lining up for the next push west. The moment the fog thinned enough to see movement, Bartz picked up the handset. Within 3 minutes, shells from the 230th began falling on the Mortain-Saint-Hilaire road. German half-tracks that had been rolling west in column, confident that the fog hid them, began exploding. Tank crews that had stopped to refuel in what they thought was a safe area behind the front found 105mm rounds landing in their midst. The fire was accurate because the coordinates had been pre-registered. Bartz and Weiss did not need to adjust from scratch. They called a target number, corrected by 50 or 100 yards, and the next salvo was on top of it. Over the course of the battle, the 230th Field Artillery Battalion would fire 8,000 rounds directed from that single hilltop. 8,000. But the Germans were not going to let a hilltop full of infantry stop a 4-division offensive. The 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division was given one job: take Hill 314. They began their first assault on the morning of August 7th. Infantry came up the eastern slope in platoon strength, probing for weak points in the American perimeter. They found wire. They found mines. They found men in foxholes who had cleared fire lanes through the brush and who opened up with rifles and Browning automatic rifles at ranges so short that the sound blurred into a single, continuous roar. The first assault was beaten back. The second came an hour later, heavier, with mortar support. It reached the wire before American machine guns broke it apart. A third assault hit the southern face of the perimeter, where Lieutenant Ronald Woody's G Company was dug in. Woody's men held. By the end of the first day, the perimeter was intact, but the cost was already visible. Wounded men lay in foxholes with no medical supplies. The aid station had been in Mortain, and Mortain was in German hands. Ammunition was running low. There was no food, no water except what the men had carried in their canteens, and there was no way off the hill. The Germans controlled every approach. That night, the second night on Hill 314, the men did something that tells you everything about what this system had become. They did not try to break out. They did not consolidate into a smaller perimeter. They improved their positions. They deepened foxholes. They redistributed ammunition from the dead to the living. They adjusted the wire where the German assaults had torn gaps in it. And Bartz and Weiss stayed on the radio because the Germans were still moving on the roads below and the guns of the 230th were still firing. The 17th SS had not taken the hill on the first day. They would try again at dawn, and again after that. And the 700 would become 600, and then 500, and the question would no longer be whether the positions could hold, but whether the men inside them could last long enough for anyone to reach them. August 9th, day 3 on the hill. The smell was the thing nobody would forget. Wounded men lay in foxholes that had become hospital beds, stretchers, and sometimes coffins. There were no medics left who had supplies to work with. The morphine was gone, the sulfa powder was gone, the bandages had been replaced by strips of torn uniform. Men with shrapnel in their legs wrapped the wounds with pieces of undershirt and kept their rifles pointed downhill. Men with stomach wounds lay still and said nothing, because there was nothing to be done for them here. A few died quietly in the night without anyone noticing until morning. The living redistributed what the dead no longer needed. Ammunition first, then canteens. A man who had been killed by a mortar fragment still had 6 clips of .30-06 in his belt. The clips went to the foxhole next to his, where 2 men had 4 rounds between them. A Browning automatic rifle, whose gunner was dead, was carried to the northern face of the perimeter, where Lieutenant Joseph Reeser's K Company was down to half strength and holding the most exposed approach. No one had eaten in 2 days. Water was gone. Some men chewed grass. Others held pebbles in their mouths to keep saliva flowing, an old trick from basic training that none of them had expected to use. And still, every time the Germans massed for another assault, the radio crackled and the shells came down. Bartz and Weiss had not slept. They worked in shifts, one watching the roads through binoculars while the other called corrections into the handset. The Germans had figured out by now that someone on the hilltop was directing the fire. They tried to locate the observers with patrols. 277 were dead, wounded, or missing. 2 out of every 5 men who had held that perimeter were casualties. The survivors were so thin and so dirty that the relieving troops did not recognize them as the same division they had seen a week earlier. Colonel Hammond Burks, commanding the 120th Infantry Regiment, reached the hilltop and looked east at the roads below. 40 wrecked German vehicles, tanks, half-tracks, trucks, armored cars, sat burned and abandoned on the Mortain-Saint-Hilaire road. The artillery called in by Bartz and Weiss from this one hilltop had destroyed more German armor than some entire divisions had faced in the war. Burke stood there for a long time. Then he said 5 words: the best sight of the war. Here is what Mortain proved, and it is the answer to the question this story has been building toward since El Guitar. What American soldiers built every night was not a foxhole. A foxhole is a hole in the ground. Any army can dig holes. The Germans dug holes, the Japanese dug holes. Every soldier in every war since antiquity has dug holes when he was frightened enough. What the American army built was a complete defensive weapon system, assembled from nothing in a single night, designed not just to protect the men inside it, but to kill everything that moved toward it. The foxhole was the smallest component. Above it was a cleared field of fire. In front of it was wire and mines. Behind it was a crawl trench linking it to the next position. And behind all of it, invisible, inaudible, miles to the rear, was the most powerful artillery arm in any army on Earth, preloaded with the mathematics of destruction, waiting for a 22-year-old lieutenant with a radio to say a number. The Germans could not break this system because they could not outpace it. It did not matter how fast their panzers moved or how skilled their infantry was. Every time the Americans stopped, for a night, for a day, for a week, the system regenerated. New ground, new foxholes, new wire, new registered coordinates. Identical result. It was like attacking a wall that rebuilt itself every time you knocked it down, and each time it came back, it was connected to the same artillery. German commanders understood pieces of this. They understood American artillery was fast and accurate. Their after-action reports say so repeatedly, with a tone that borders on disbelief. They understood American infantry dug in quickly. The evidence was in front of them every morning. But what they never fully grasped was that these were not separate capabilities. They were one system, designed as a whole, trained as a whole, executed as a whole, by men who had practiced it so many times that it no longer required thought. And that is the deepest layer of the answer. The system could not be broken because it was not a plan. It was a habit. Plans require orders, coordination, communication, all of which can be disrupted. Habits survive disruption. On Hill 314, the chain of command was severed in the first hour. Resupply never arrived. Communications with division were intermittent at best. The battalion commander was gone. The senior officer was a 24-year-old farmer who had never commanded more than a company. None of that mattered. The men dug because digging was what they did. The observers called fire because calling fire was what they did. The gunners miles away computed and fired because that was what they did. No one needed to be told. The system ran on muscle memory, not on orders. This is what the Germans faced at Mortain. Not courage, though there was courage. Not desperation, though there was desperation. A system so deeply embedded in the bodies of the men who operated it that it functioned perfectly even when everything around it had collapsed. Operation Lüttich cost the German army thousands of casualties and more than 100 armored vehicles. It gained 5 miles of ground that was abandoned within days. The forces Hitler had committed to the counteroffensive were now trapped in a salient that the Allies, attacking from 3 sides, would close into the Falaise Pocket, the greatest German defeat in Western Europe. 300,000 soldiers of the German 7th Army were encircled. 50,000 were captured. 10,000 were killed. The equipment losses were so total that entire divisions ceased to exist. All of it began with 700 men on a hilltop who did what their sergeants had taught them to do on the night they arrived. But there is one more piece of this story, and it goes back to the beginning, to a tool, a training camp, and a 24-year-old with mortar barrages aimed at the summit, with snipers positioned on adjacent ridges. Bartz and Weiss changed positions, crawling between foxholes, never transmitting from the same spot twice. They survived because the holes they were crawling between were deep enough to disappear into. 4 feet of earth that had been dug on the night of August 6th by men who had followed the standard, even though the standard had seemed pointless at the time. Think about that. The positions that were keeping Bartz and Weiss alive on day 3 were positions that had been dug in 6 hours by soldiers who did not yet know they would be surrounded, who did not know they would spend nearly a week on this hill, who dug because the army told them to dig whenever they stopped, and who had been told so many times in so many training camps by so many sergeants with stopwatches that they did it without thinking. That reflex was now the only thing between the German 7th Army and the road to Avranches. And it was not only Hill 314. Across the entire front of the 30th Division, the same pattern was repeating. The 117th Infantry Regiment, dug in around the village of St. Barthélemy north of Mortain, absorbed the 2nd Panzer Division's assault and held. The 119th Infantry, positioned to the south, stopped elements of the 1st SS Panzer, Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, the most decorated armored division in the German military, in fighting so close that American riflemen were shooting at tank commanders standing in open turret hatches. Every one of these positions had been built the same way. Foxholes connected by crawl trenches, wire in the approaches, mines beyond the wire, artillery pre-registered on every piece of dead ground. The template was identical, the execution was local, adapted to each hedgerow, each slope, each crossroads by company commanders who had walked the terrain at dusk with their forward observers and made the same decisions that every American company commander had been trained to make. And the result was identical too. German armor reached the wire and stopped. German infantry crossed the open ground and was broken by artillery that arrived faster than any German officer believed possible. Counterattacks that were planned against positions that had not existed 24 hours earlier hit defenses that looked like they had been there for weeks. By August 9th, the German High Command knew that Lüttich had failed. Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, who had argued against the operation from the beginning, reported to Hitler that the offensive had gained barely 5 miles and was now stalled on every axis. The fog that had shielded the panzers on the first morning was gone. American P-47 Thunderbolts owned the sky, and every German vehicle that moved on a road in daylight burned. More than 100 German tanks and armored vehicles were already destroyed or abandoned. Hitler ordered the attack to continue. Von Kluge obeyed, because disobeying Hitler in August of 1944 meant a bullet or a noose. But the divisions that were supposed to be driving toward the coast were now fighting to hold what little ground they had taken, and losing men they could not replace against positions they could not break. On Hill 314, the perimeter shrank slightly as casualties forced Erickson to pull his outermost positions inward. But the corps held. The foxholes held. The 2 men with the radio held. On August 10th, the division attempted an airdrop to resupply the hilltop. Small artillery spotter planes, loaded with ammunition and medical supplies, flew low over the summit and pushed bundles out the doors. German anti-aircraft fire hit one of the planes. It crashed. The other bundles landed outside the perimeter, in ground the Germans controlled. Almost nothing reached the men who needed it. Erickson called a meeting of his company commanders that night. Reeser, Woody, Curley, Byrne, the men who had held the 4 faces of the perimeter through 3 days of assault. They were down to fewer than 500 men. Ammunition was critically low. Some rifles had no rounds at all. The mortars had almost nothing left to fire. The question was simple: hold or try to break out. They decided to hold, not because they had been ordered to. The radio link to division was intermittent, and no one at division could see what they were facing. They held because the positions were still intact, because Bartz and Weiss were still calling fire, and because leaving the hill meant crossing open ground under German guns, the same open ground that the Germans could not cross under American guns. The system worked in both directions. It kept the enemy out, and it kept the defenders in. And on the morning of August 11th, the Germans came again. But this time, something was different. Not on the hill, on the roads south of it. American tanks were moving, and they were not moving west. August 12th, 1944. Sixth day on the hill. Late morning. The men in the foxholes heard engines again, but this time from the west. American engines. The sound of Shermans grinding through hedgerow gaps, and with them the clatter of half-tracks carrying infantry from the 35th Division, which Patton had ordered north to break through to Mortain. On the road south of Hill 314, elements of the 3rd Armored Division were pushing east, compressing the German salient from below. The SS units that had spent 5 days trying to take the hilltop were now the ones in danger of being surrounded. The 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division pulled back. Not all at once. Some units fought rearguard actions on the lower slopes, but by midday, the pressure on the perimeter had dropped to nothing for the first time since August 7th. Ericsson's men heard the firing fade to the east, heard American voices on the trails below, and for a few minutes did not know if they could believe it. Then, the first patrol from the relieving force reached the summit. The soldiers who climbed Hill 314 that afternoon expected to find the remnants of a battalion. What they found looked like something from an earlier war. Foxholes everywhere, deep, properly cut, connected by trenches that zigzagged across the hilltop. Tangles of wire in the approaches, some of it strung with empty ration cans that served as rattles. Shell craters overlapping each other so thickly that the hillside looked plowed. Spent brass cartridges covering the ground like gravel. And in the foxholes, men who did not look like soldiers anymore. Gaunt, filthy, some too weak to stand, most with the blank-eyed stare of men who had not slept in 6 days. 357 men walked off Hill 314 under their own power. Out of roughly 700 who had climbed it on August 6th, captain from Iowa, who walked down a hill with half his men and never talked about it for the rest of his life. Reynold Ericsson went home to Iowa. He did not write a memoir. He did not give speeches. He went back to the land he had left. The flat black soil between Des Moines and Ames, where the corn grows chest-high by July, and the biggest sound on a summer night is the wind in the stalks. He married. He farmed. He raised a family in the kind of quiet that only a man who has lived through 6 days of continuous shelling can truly hear. He received the Distinguished Service Cross for Hill 314. So did his 4 company commanders, Reeser, Woody, Curley, and Byrne. The entire 2nd Battalion of the 120th Infantry earned the Presidential Unit Citation, one of the highest honors a unit can receive. The citation used words like extraordinary heroism and conspicuous gallantry. It did not mention entrenching tools. Charles Bartz and Robert Weiss, the 2 forward observers who had called in 8,000 rounds from a foxhole near the summit, both survived the war. Weiss was 23 when he sat on that hilltop and directed the destruction of a Panzer Division supply column. He went home and lived a long life. Bartz did the same. Neither man became famous. The work they did, lying in a hole in the ground, watching roads through binoculars, whispering numbers into a radio handset, was not the kind of work that produces headlines. It was the kind of work that produces victory. The 30th Division fought on after Mortain. Through the Falaise Pocket, through Belgium, through the Siegfried Line, into Germany. They were one of the divisions that held the northern shoulder of the Bulge in December of 1944, when the Germans launched their last great offensive in the Ardennes. And there, in the frozen forests of Belgium, in temperatures that dropped to 30 below, the men of Old Hickory did what they always did. They stopped. They dug, they wired, they registered. And when the German assault hit their positions at dawn, it broke against the same system that had broken the SS at Mortain 4 months earlier. The Germans never found an answer. Not at Mortain, not in the Ardennes, not anywhere on the Western Front. Every time they planned a counterattack based on the positions they had observed at dusk, they arrived at dawn to discover that the ground had changed. Foxholes where there had been flat earth, wire where there had been open lanes, and the terrible, invisible math of American artillery, already solved, already loaded, waiting for a voice on a radio. Now go back to where this story started. March of 1943, the Tunisian desert. Men of the 1st Infantry Division on their knees in the dark, hammering picks into limestone, scraping gravel with folding shovels that the army had copied from a German design. They did not know that they were building the prototype for a system that would be used across 2 continents and 3 years of war. They only knew that 5 weeks earlier, at a place called Kasserine, men who did not dig had died. The lesson was simple. The execution was not. Because the system that stopped the 10th Panzer at El Guitar and the 2nd SS Panzer at Mortain and the 5th Panzer Army in the Ardennes was not built on a battlefield. It was built in training camps in South Carolina and Georgia and Texas by sergeants who made 18-year-old boys dig foxholes in clay until their hands bled, and then made them do it again and again, until the act of digging was no longer a decision. It was built by forward observer schools that taught young lieutenants to read terrain the way a musician reads a score, seeing not what was there, but what would happen there. It was built by artillerymen who could compute firing data in minutes and distribute it to a dozen batteries before the infantry had finished stringing wire. And it was built by an institutional culture that had the honesty to look at its own dead at Kasserine Pass and say, "We did this wrong. We will not do it wrong again." That is the answer. What American soldiers built every night was not a position. It was the proof that an army can learn faster than its enemy can adapt. The foxhole was just the visible part. Beneath it was a doctrine, behind it was an artillery system, and underneath all of it was something no enemy could see or measure or counter. The decision, made once in the North African desert and never reversed, that every American soldier, every night, no matter how tired, no matter how far from the enemy, no matter how close to the end of the war, would stop and dig. The Germans built fortifications that took months and lasted years. The Americans built fortifications that took hours and lasted until dawn, and the ones that lasted until dawn won the war. Reynold Erickson died in Iowa. He never talked much about the hill. His neighbors knew he had been in the war. Most of them had been in the war. In that part of the country, in that generation, it was not something you discussed. It was something you carried. The way you carry a folding shovel on your hip. Heavy enough to notice, light enough to bear. Always there. The positions on Hill 314 are still visible. If you visit Mortain today, you can walk up the slope to a park at the summit, where observation platforms stand on the same ground where Bartz and Weiss lay with their radio. The foxholes are overgrown now, shallow depressions in the grass, softened by 80 years of rain. But they are there. You can see them if you know what you are looking at. Small, quiet scars in the earth, dug by hand, in the dark, by men who knew exactly what they were building. And what they were building held. Thank you for watching this all the way through. If this story meant something to you, a like genuinely helps. It tells the algorithm that this kind of history matters, and it helps these stories find the people who want to hear them. If you're not subscribed yet, I'd be honored if you joined us. Hit subscribe and the bell so you don't miss the next one. I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Where are you watching from today? And if someone in your family served in the Second World War, a father, a grandfather, a great uncle who never talked about it, tell us about them. Every one of those stories deserves to be remembered. Thank you. I'll see you in the next one.